thank you all so much for joining us today, and a special thanks to the Broward Sheriff's Office and Sheriff Al Lamberti for helping us put the roundtable together today and always being such gracious hosts. Unfortunately, recent news articles have reminded us that South Florida continues to lead the nation in reports of identity theft. Come balance this out over here. We really continue to lead the nation in reports of identity theft. As you all well know, identity theft can occur in a variety of ways, but whatever the method, dealing with identity theft can be emotionally and physically exhausting, damaging to your finances, and time-consuming to correct. With more and more people paying their bills and filing their taxes electronically, we need to be sure that law enforcement has the resources and the authority they need to keep pace with new trends in identity theft. We've seen significant increase in requests for assistance with identity theft cases, especially among seniors in my district offices. I can't believe the explosion of calls that I have gotten from seniors and from other constituents that I represent who have been the victim of all kinds of identity theft, but particularly the newest that we've seen, which is you have people fraudulently filing other people's tax returns, collecting their refund. Then when the taxpayer goes to file their return, they're told by the IRS it was already filed and the refund given to someone else. We have to take extra care with these cases because there's sensitive information involved, which sometimes creates unique challenges for law enforcement in tracking down perpetrators. And the folks joining me today will talk about that from their perspective. As tax season is upon us, we're all seeing more and more South Floridians reporting that their tax returns have already been filed by someone else who stole their identity. The Florida delegation in Congress is working hard to respond to this growing issue in our state and nationally, and do what we can to help law enforcement crack down on offenders. I'm a co-sponsor of legislation led by Senator Bill Nelson and my fellow colleague, Florida Congresswoman Kathy Castor of Tampa, that addresses many of the concerns that we've heard from law enforcement across the state and nationwide over the past few years. But I heard today from many different sides of this equation, both civil at the FTC, as well as the law enforcement community and the U.S. Attorney's Office, who really have so many cross jurisdictions, and this was an opportunity to bring them all together, have them talk and be at the same table, and figure out what the obstacles are that they can help each other with in removing, but also that I can help remove as a member of Congress legislatively, but also in talking with federal agencies to make sure that the barriers that don't require legislation to remove them are able to be removed. Because sometimes bureaucratic red tape just builds up, even among interagency cooperation that ultimately impacts consumers negatively. So that's part of my job as a member of Congress, is to help constituents, and I count the folks who work on the front lines every day as constituents too, even constituent agencies, be able to cut away that red tape and make sure that we can make government work more effectively for everyone. We have to make sure that the fines and the penalties that are levied against perpetrators of identity theft are significant enough, and I learned that today, that's a big part of the problem, because the fines and the penalties are tied to the amount, and oftentimes the penalty is very small, that there's not a very big disincentive in the law to deter this kind of crime from being repeated over and over, even when a penalty has been enacted against a perpetrator. Now, in Washington, I've been gathering additional ideas for legislation and other things that we can do to help fight identity theft, but there's never anything better than sitting down with the folks in my local community who are on the front lines dealing with this every day, and also constituents who I've been able to assist in combating the identity theft they've experienced personally right here in South Florida. So I really believe we have to work together to find solutions to help folks in South Florida protect their identities and ensure that any complaints and reports of fraud are sent to the IRS, or that we make sure that no matter what the identity theft is, that we can make sure that there's a law enforcement initiative in place to be able to go after that criminal. Part of why I came here today was to hear directly from our experts and our folks on the front lines on how identity theft is being tackled here in South Florida, in Broward County, and get their take on the most pressing concerns so I can take those back to Washington. Sometimes it's just a matter of my talking with the agency leaders in Washington, D.C. Doesn't even need legislation. You can just kind of explain to them that maybe they're not using common sense, and maybe they're not interpreting Congress's intent correctly, and we can set them a little bit straight and get things figured out. So that's a big part of my job, and it's why I'm really thrilled to have been able to sit down with all the folks here. We have a number of folks who are here with us that are going to talk about their experience professionally, and my constituent Flora Goldberg is joining us here today to talk about what she went through. But first, I want to ask Sergeant Jay Liner from BSO to spend a few moments talking about how he deals with this every day.
Thank you. Sergeant, could you spell your name, please? Yes. L-E-I-N-E-R. First name is Jay, J-A-Y. I'm a sergeant with the Broward Sheriff's Office, Economic Crime Unit. In the roundtable, what the Congresswoman and other individuals that were there discussed is some of the issues that we are having. In fact, the Sheriff's Office is in partnership with the Internal Revenue Service, Secret Service, and Department of Homeland Security to combat this type of fraud. And one of our biggest things that we found as we brought up to the Congresswoman is that our main issue is if we go for disclosure. And we explained to the Congresswoman that part of the issue is that the disclosure issue with the IRS and Internal Revenue Service stops us and prohibits us a lot of times from prosecuting at state. If we can get that changed, we can start charging at the state level. As partnership with the other federal agencies, we can work the federal cases. We also, with the Sheriff's Office, will continue to take the identity theft reports. We will forward this information to the Internal Revenue Service, and we're going to work very closely on it. And hopefully, with the legislature that the Congresswoman is hoping to get passed, it'll make it much easier for state and local law enforcement, along with federal, to get these people off the street. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I want to illuminate what Sergeant Liner just referred to related to disclosure. What I learned at our roundtable was that when a constituent like Mrs. Goldberg finds that someone else filed her tax return fraudulently and collected her refund, and they usually discover that when they go to file their tax return and are told by the IRS that somebody already did. When law enforcement at the state level or at the local level goes to the IRS and says, well, we need to be able to use that tax return as evidence, even though they have Mrs. Goldberg's social security number, even though they have her name, even though she is able to prove that that tax return was filed by someone else, and that is her, using her information, the law now is being interpreted by the IRS that the identity protection is for the person who perpetrated the identity theft, no longer to the person whose identity is stolen. So what happens is local and state law enforcement, when they go to prosecute, and they'll file in state court, but when they go, just to get them into the system, when they go through the process of trying to prosecute them, they can't use the evidence because the thief's identity is protected once the IRS has that information and there's an acknowledgement that it's been stolen. I mean, that defies logic. There isn't any way that through the years Congress intended for that to be the case. So we definitely need to clarify that in the law, but we also need to, and I plan to follow up with the IRS and folks in Washington, to understand how it is that they could be interpreting the law that way to protect the thief rather than the person who is the victim of the identity theft. So now I want to call on Cindy Leibs from the Federal Trade Commission, who can talk about the civil side of this really terrible problem.
I'm Cindy Leibs with the Federal Trade Commission. Do you need to spell my name? It's L-I-E-B-E-S. The Federal Trade Commission is the Federal Consumer Protection Agency, and we have a database called the Consumer Sentinel Database. It's a fabulous database where we get millions of consumer complaints from consumers about all sorts of issues dealing with fraud, and the #1 area of consumer complaints that we receive is identity theft complaints. Almost every week we receive approximately 35,000 consumer complaints, whether it's by telephone or by internet. But just in the past few weeks, we've seen a huge uptick. 2 weeks ago, we saw about 40,000 complaints that we got. This week alone, we saw 50,000 complaints, and the bulk of the uptick were complaints that were filed by consumers about identity theft relating to their tax returns. So we've seen an enormous uptick. We have been working with the IRS, and they've been wonderful to make sure that these complaints get into our database. Consumers can call the FTC at 1-877-ID-THEFT and speak with someone who can help them take charge and know what to do if their identity's been stolen. They can also go online at ftc.gov and get wonderful information on how to either prevent identity theft, to deter it, to detect it, and to defend from it. But we've also come out with a great new brochure called Taking Charge. This brochure tells you what to do if your identity's been stolen. It takes a consumer or a victim all the way through the process to know what to do, how to do it, how to fill out an affidavit, how to contact your creditors, so that the identity theft and the identity thieves can be caught and that the consumer can get out of a really bad situation.
Thank you so much, Cindy. Thank you. And now I'd like to ask a constituent of mine, Flora Goldberg, to share her story. She contacted my office when she realized that she was the victim of identity theft and wanted to have her share her story with us. Thank you.
I'm Flora Goldberg. The first indication I had that there was a problem was in June of 2011. I received a letter from IRS saying that they could not process my refund because they received another return with my Social Security number. When I first received this letter, I was not concerned because my first thought was that it was a clerical error, that somebody used the wrong Social Security number, or that my accountant had filed somebody else's return with my number. Excuse me. I called my accountant. My accountant assured me that it was not her error, that it was probably the error of the IRS, and that just give them the information they're asking for. I did that, and 30 days later I called IRS to get an update, and I was told it was still being investigated. 30 days after that I called again, and I was told it was still being investigated. Finally, in September, I said, I think it's time for me to go see Debbie Wasserman Schultz. And at Debbie's office, I met Michael Lickerman, and Michael took all my information and he passed it on to the taxpayer's advocate. 2 weeks later, I received a letter from the taxpayer advocate stating that I may have been a victim of identity theft. Now, this is the first time I had heard the words identity theft, and it was like a bolt of lightning. I could not believe that my Social Security number was in the hands of somebody who should not have that number. The young lady at the advocate's office was very confident. She assured me I had nothing to worry about, but what upset me most, that from the time I filed my return till September, I could have alerted the credit reporting agencies of the problem, but the IRS never told me that they suspected identity theft. And so it wasn't until October that I contacted all the agencies and put a security alert on my number. I have since been able to receive my return, excuse me, and I thank the advocate's office for that. They were very comforting and they were very assuring. But the fear is not gone, because now I know my number is out there with somebody who should not have it. So I know that I have to check my credit reports constantly and just be on my toes.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. We'll be glad to take any questions.